Hey, and welcome to the CSS and JavaScript Fundamentals module. In this module, you are going to start out by learning some more CSS fundamentals before we move on to a bunch of challenges to test your skills. Then we'll jump over to JavaScript, where you get to build real-world components for websites through a bunch of challenges. Finally, you are going to wrap it all up by building a really cool game. So let's have a look at all of these projects. First, you'll start out building your own portfolio page so that you can showcase your work and show who you are to future employers. Then you'll move on to build these JavaScript components that are critical to most websites. For example, this modal right here, and this search form, and also a carousel. In the JavaScript section, you're also going to build a dice game before you wrap it all up with the well-known snake game that some of us had on our Nokia phones about 20 years ago. And the teachers in this module is Kevin Powell, whom you already know, Carl Hadman, who's a developer with over 10 years of experience and also a popular YouTube teacher. It is yours truly. And finally, you're going to meet Anya Kubo. She works for Free Code Camp as one of their teachers, and she's quickly amassed over 100,000 followers on her own personal YouTube channel this last year. But before we jump into all of this, there's of course one thing you need to do, and that is to click this image right here so that you are taken to the Today I Will channel, where you are to share with us that you're going to start Module 4 so that we can stand on the sidelines and cheer for you. And once you've done that, we'll get started with the module.
Welcome to the CSS Fundamentals module of this course, where we're going to be looking at the fundamentals of CSS pretty much. As we've done the crash course, we've learned how to start putting websites together. The first step to making awesome, responsive websites, though, is we have to make sure we have a strong foundation in the fundamentals of CSS. So in this module of the course, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the CSS box model. I know we already looked at it, so we're going to do a refresher on what it is. We're going to look a little bit more detail on how to pick between margins and padding. We're going to be looking at something called collapsing margins, which are a pain in the butt. We're also going to be looking at the different types of elements. We have inline elements, block elements, and we're also going to explore inline block. We're also going to look into specificity and compound selectors. So we're going to look at the very basics of specificity. I might say specificity a lot, and I guarantee you I will, because I can never say that bloody word. We're also going to look at the basics of compound selectors, of how compound selectors affect the specificity of a selector, and some advice and best practice to avoid running into problems when we're naming our classes, because most of this is going to revolve around class naming and stuff like that. We're also going to be touching on the basics of typography. So something called inheritance. We're going to be looking at the font family property, so we can actually start creating font family. We can actually start using different fonts. With font family comes font stacks as well, and how we can start using Google Fonts so we can start getting fonts that look a little bit nicer maybe than the defaults that we're sort of stuck with if we're not using web fonts. I'm going to throw in a few extras along the way too. We're going to be looking at styling links and their different states, creating buttons, or more specifically making links that look like buttons, but a lot of this would also apply to an actual button in a form or something like that. We're going to look at how to approach a simple layout and how we can get backgrounds to be full width, even if the content is contained in a smaller space. You might have noticed, and you might be going, whoa, that's a lot of stuff. We are going to be touching on a lot of different concepts throughout this module. I've put these lessons together so they flow from one to the next, though. It's really meant that they're building on top of each other. We're going to be working a lot of the time on one single layout and just sort of adding new stuff to it to improve upon it. We're not just throwing all these things randomly at you. They are going to build on top of each other, but it is a lot of different concepts. So if ever you're not sure on something, really please don't be scared to revisit individual lessons in the future. While I've made them to build one on top of each other for you now while you're going through the course, later on, if you need to go back to one of them, they will stand on their own. So if you go, oh man, I forgot about how a font stack works, you can go back to the lesson on font family and font stack. Or if you forget what specificity is and you want a lesson on that and to understand it better, you can go and revisit the couple of lessons that you're going to have on that. A bit of a preview of what we're going to be working on. We're going to be starting to work on this. And we're going to be spending a lot of time on this and sort of a continuation of that layout a little bit. And then this is the final project that we're going to be building out for this lesson. So you can see so you can get a little bit of an idea of where we're going with this module. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Over the next few videos, we're going to be taking a deeper exploration into margin and padding than we did in the crash course. We're going to be looking at properly. And it's also really important. We're going to see that margins have this really strange behavior where they can merge together, and that can cause confusion and problems. So in the first video of this module, we saw the layout that we're going to be building. So we're going to be starting at working our way towards this, and then we're going to sort of fancy it up a little bit once we've gotten this one under control. It's a nice way to start exploring margins and padding. And the first thing we're going to be looking at is the space between our headings and paragraphs. So anything that's really type related, this includes lists and other things as well, it is controlled by the margin top and the bottom. Remember, margin is empty space. It's what's used to push things away. So our heading elements as well as our paragraphs, they have a margin right and left of 0, but they have a margin top and bottom. This, by default, is roughly the same as their font size. So if you make the font size of an element bigger, that space above and below is going to grow with it. It's actually exactly the same as the font size, except for the H1 where it's a little bit smaller. But if you just remember that the space above and below all of my text related elements is pretty much the font size, you're completely good to go. When we're creating a layout like this, we have these empty spaces. So let's go and take a look at how we can control them a bit. Because if we look here, this space is bigger than some of these other spaces that we have right now. We want to be able to control these spaces properly. So what I've done is I've already set the foundation for this. We just are going to be playing a little bit with some of the other things on it and exploring this to understand how the spacing works exactly. So if we come and just look really fast at the markup of this, I have a div class of card. That div class of card, so that is what has my black background on it. I have an H1 and a paragraph in there. And those links down at the bottom are actually in their own paragraph that has a class of links on it. And then I have my 2 paragraphs right there. If we come over to my styles, all I've done is given myself the black background with a white color, and I've put a set width on this, and I've given the font size of 24 pixels and a font size of 18 pixels here. So before I jump into it and we start exploring a little bit, see if you remember from the first module of this course when we did the little HTML and CSS crash course, if you remember how you can use margins to center this card on the screen instead of having it stuck to the left side. So I'm going to let you do that now, and then I'll come through and do it myself. Awesome. So hopefully you remembered to do it. We want to set the margin left to auto and the margin right to auto. And that will center the card on the screen because it's automatically putting an equal amount of space on the 2 sides. So if I make this bigger or smaller, it stays perfectly centered on the screen just like that. Now, there's also a shorthand, and maybe you even wrote it with the shorthand when you did it before. And the shorthand is first the top and the bottom, which I'm going to set to 0, and then the left and the right, which I'm going to set to auto. So 0 auto will do the exact same thing that we just had where we can center it on the screen like that. Now I want to control the spacing around these a little bit. As I mentioned, we already have some default spacing on there. We can see there is some space here and some space here, which I didn't create. This is the margin top and bottom that's coming on our text automatically that's creating these spaces. So what we want right now is this space here to be quite a bit bigger. If we look at the layout, this space is quite a bit bigger than what we currently have right here. So let's increase that space there. I'm going to let you try and figure out how to do it. If you're not sure, we only want that one to have a bigger space. So go look at the index if you have to. Look at how the markup is in there and see if you can see where to put your margins to make that a larger space. And then in a couple of seconds, I'll do it myself. Great, so let's go back and look at my index here, and we can see that, as I mentioned, we have a regular paragraph, and then I have a paragraph here, but this one has a class of links on it. That means I can select this class without selecting my other paragraph. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll come here, and we'll do dot links, and open and close curly braces, and I'm going to say a margin top. Now, if you remember, I said that if you're not sure how big you want to make it, if you remember, the default margin top and bottom will be the same as the font size. So right now my margin top on it is 18 pixels. I want to make that bigger. So I'm going to come through and make that 32 pixels to double up on the amount of space that was there. And now we can go and take a look. And it is bigger. Maybe we can make that a little bit bigger. Let's make it up to 40, just so it's a lot more noticeable. And now we have quite a bigger gap. Now, if you went through and put a margin bottom just on all of the paragraphs, it actually would have worked, but that's going to cause a problem that we're going to run into later and something I'm actually going to talk about a little bit later on. But for now, if that's the approach you took, you're at least thinking about it in the right way because you were thinking, well, let's add some space underneath this one. Technically, that also added some space underneath here, but at this time, it didn't affect the layout at all. We're actually going to see why that is in the next lesson and the problems they can cause and how you can get around them. All right, we're going to be looking at collapsing margins in this video. So if you remembered in the last video, I said that all of our text, our headings, our paragraphs, all of that comes by default with a margin on the top and the bottom. So when we have our layout that looks like this, we have a margin on the top and on the bottom here that we're not really seeing in our current layout. And that's because of something called collapsing margins. By default, margins collapse into one another. So that means if one element has a margin bottom of 50 pixels and the next element has a margin top of 50 pixels, the space between them will actually be 50 pixels and not 100 pixels. Let's take a look because it can be a little bit confusing when you hear it like that. So right now on our links here, we added a margin top of 40. I'm going to come on here and put a margin bottom of 40 pixels as well. But if we come and look, this space is exactly the same as what it was before. And even I mentioned that we have a default on here. Even if I don't put a margin bottom on here, by default, this paragraph has a margin bottom of 18 pixels on it. So even though I have 18 pixel margin there, and then I've put a margin top on my links, so right here on my links, I put a margin top, this space is still 40 pixels. It's not adding those two margins together. Let's do this so we can see both of them at the same time. So I'm just focusing on the space between my links at the bottom and the paragraph above it. So on on the paragraphs, if I say margin bottom is 100 pixels, you can see that there I have a 100 pixel space. So if I change this margin top here to 75 pixels, nothing's going to happen. These do not get added together, they're merging. So between the two of them, it's the bigger of the two that will win. So the only time I can get this to be bigger than 100 is if I make this actually bigger. And now you can see it's increased that space. If I make it 120, it's still bigger. And then once I get to 100, or if I go smaller, now this is the bigger one, so this is the winning one. So if two margins collapse, it's always the bigger of the two values. It's never adding the two of them together. I'm being very repetitive, but it's super important to understand that. For the most part, collapsing margins are a good thing because it makes it really predictable when we're trying to figure out this space. I don't have to go, okay, this is 50 pixels plus 50, or this is 100 plus 10. You can know exactly how big it's going to be between two elements because it's always the bigger number. So that makes our lives much easier. But one of the places where they do cause problems is because margins will collapse anytime they touch each other. If the first child is an element that has a margin top, that can merge with the parent's margin top. I'm going to say it again just to help reinforce that because this is a little bit weird, and then we're going to actually see it. So if the first child in an element has a margin top, that margin top can and will merge with the parent's margin top. So let's take a look at what I mean. And this is why right now, actually, in the margin bottom, it's the same with a margin bottom and a margin top. Right now, my paragraphs have a margin bottom of 100 pixels. And if we come and look, this blue text that you can barely see here, my links, these here, they're 100, they have a margin bottom of 100 pixels on them. So why isn't the black background extending 100 pixels lower? Or why do I not have a space on top of this? And one of the most common things I see people at the beginning when they're getting used to CSS doing is going, I want to move this text here, this H1, my title, I want to move it down within my black box. I know that margins are empty space. So on my H1, I'm going to add a margin top of 100 pixels because I want to move that down inside my black box. Oh my goodness, what just happened? It moved my whole box down. I don't want that to happen. I want my black border to start up here. But I'm adding my margin top on the H1. I'm not adding it to the card. So why is the entire card moving? So what's happening is, if we go and look at the markup, my H1 is the very first thing inside my card. So my H1 is touching the top of my card. If my H1 is touching the top of my card, they're both lined up with each other at the top. My H1, if it has a margin top on it, its margin top is going to combine with my card's margin top, even though the card has a 0 margin on it right now. That margin of 0 is still its margin. So it's going to merge this margin of 0 with this margin of 100 pixels, and because they're merged, the whole thing moves down. And this is a really awkward and annoying behavior. It drives people nuts. Luckily, there is a solution, and it's a relatively easy solution. This is where padding comes into play. In general, the background color will always be on the parent, so we can add padding to the parent to prevent the parent's margin from merging with the child's. It's really hard to visualize in the actual editor, so I'm going to do it here for the moment, where we have all of our text like this, and we have that margin top here and a margin bottom down here. And if we want this extra black space, on the parent, we add padding. Now, if you remember, it's always padding, border, margin. So this padding is creating a buffer between the margin of my H1 and the margin of the card itself. That buffer means the two margins aren't touching anymore, so they don't merge anymore, and now we can predictably move things around within our box. So what I'm going to do is let's come in and try that out. So actually, I'm going to have you try that out. Add some padding to the card and see what happens, and see if you can start predicting how things are going to move around in a lot simpler of a way, and do it with the padding shorthand. Don't just add padding top. Give it padding, say 50 pixels the whole way around. All right, so I'm going to do what I just said you should do, is add padding here, and we'll do 50 pixels. And now it should be a lot easier to predict. So we can see that I have this space, this really big space. So what this is I have 50 pixels of padding plus that margin top I put on my text. I also, at the bottom of this, if we come and look down, I have this big giant gap at the bottom here because on my paragraphs, I put the margin bottom to 100 pixels. So that margin bottom on this is creating this big gap that I'm getting here at the bottom here. So let's take that off because we really don't need it. And let's take this margin top off. And you can see that this is starting to be a little bit more consistent now. We can use more background, we use padding, and then for the spacing between elements, we can use our margins. So on my links here, I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger because I shrank it down during the demo. I think we said around 40 or 45. We'll go with 45 and leave it there for now. In the next video, I'm going to look at how we can be more consistent with our margins, just to make sure when we have backgrounds like this, the spacing is exactly what we want it to be, and how we can actually do it in a really, really easy way with a new way to select stuff. To help our layouts be more consistent and get rid of weird spacing and all of that, the easiest thing to do is to be consistent with our margins with type. So for consistency, we often turn off the margin top on typography related elements, so our paragraphs or headings, all of that stuff. That way we can use padding on the parent and know the exact spacing that we can have, and we can keep it consistent on all the sides. Also, when we get into more advanced layouts and we're using Flexbox and we're going to be using CSS Grid, margins no longer collapse in those situations. So this just helps us stay more consistent in terms of how we work. So we're always working in the same way, and we don't get these weird behaviors that are changing depending on the context of how we're making a layout, which is just super annoying. So it could be really painful because you might have to go H1, margin top 0, H2, margin top 0, H3, margin top 0, H4. Okay, I think you get the point. You go through all of them, that's going to drive you crazy. We can actually do all of this with one single selector though. If we comma separate our selectors, we can select as many things as we want with a single selector just by comma separating them. In this example, I've shown H1, H2, H3, and paragraph and put margin top to 0. You can also do this with classes. You just include the dot in there. It works exactly the same way. It's super, super simple and a nice way to cut down on how much code you're actually writing. So let's go and look at how we can improve the consistency on this site right here, because we added the padding on this one. But the problem we have is we have this nice padding of 45 pixels here, but this here is actually bigger because it's including the margin top plus the padding. And we can see the space on the bottom is also bigger. So what I want you to try and do is come through and turn off the margin top. In this case, you don't have to do a whole lot of selectors. We only need our H1 and our paragraph. There's nothing else that needs to be selected. So make a selector that has both the H1 and the paragraph and just set the margin top to 0 on it. Then I'm going to run through and do it myself and just give you a little bit of tips on how I organize my CSS when I'm doing this. So I hope you got it working. I'm actually going to pull this up, but leave it on the side here just so we can see this as it's going, so we can see the difference. And I'm actually going to come up here to do this selector. This is not a rule that you have to follow, but whenever I'm selecting multiple elements with one selector, I like to do it before I get to the detailed versions of those same selectors. The specific selectors themselves, like I'm doing here with my H1 and my paragraph, where I have them on their own. You don't have to do it this way. You can have it technically anywhere. I just find it easier to know that anytime I have multiple selectors, the individual ones will be following that afterwards. So it's consistent for me when I'm looking through my CSS. So I'm going to do my H1, I'm going to do comma and put my paragraph like that and come through and say margin top is 0. And as soon as I do that, you can see that this space has become a little bit different. So let's go and turn off that margin top. And you can see it's a little bit higher. And when I put it back on, it has sucked everything up a little bit. The nice thing with this is because there's a margin bottom still on my H1, I still have this space. Even if I didn't have this bigger margin top on here, I still know that that space, I would still have a space from the default margin bottom coming on all of my paragraphs. Now, the one problem that we have run into is we do have this extra space here down at the bottom. There's two different ways we can handle it. One of them, which you already know, so see if you can think of how we could get rid of this space here without creating any new selectors. It would go in one of the existing selectors that we currently have. Now, you might have said your paragraph, we could come through on here and say margin bottom is 0. And in this specific case, it would work. The time that would get you into trouble, though, is we've already said paragraphs have a margin top of 0. And so if we said all my paragraphs have a margin top of 0 and a margin bottom of 0, well, it's working in this case. If you had any other design where you probably have multiple paragraphs in a row, this would get you into trouble because now those two paragraphs are touching. And that we would not want to have. We want to make sure that we have that space still between the paragraphs to make it much more obvious they actually are paragraphs and make sure it's easy to read. So in this case, what we'd want to do is actually on this links. Because my links is the thing all the way down here at the bottom, I want to put a margin bottom of 0 on that. So this is making sure that at the top, everything is always going to be consistent. What's annoying about this is you'd always have to find the last thing and actually turn off the margin bottom manually on it. Now, for now, I think that's fine because there are more advanced ways to do it. We're going to get into those more advanced ways a little bit later on, though, because it gets into these a bit weird selectors that I don't want to touch on just yet. And again, I'm specifically choosing the last thing in here because I want to make sure that only this last item doesn't have the margin because I want to keep all of my other margins in there. So for now, that will be it on margins and padding. We've sort of understood them. If you want to play around with this a little bit more, just to make sure that you're really comfortable with the different things I've covered here with collapsing margins and with this idea, it would be actually, I know we haven't done a lot of content now, but it's kind of weird. So I'd really encourage you to play around with it as much as you can to make sure you're understanding it. Before we move on, we're going to go back into inline and block elements, look at the differences between them and how we can actually style them up and start styling links and doing some fun stuff with that to start making this layout look a little bit nicer. All right, for inline and block behavior, we've looked in the crash course that we have block elements in inline. I talked a little bit about it, but I never really went deep into what they are. So block level elements will create a new line of content stacking on top of each other by default. We've seen this already. These are the things like paragraphs, headings, lists, list items, divs, as well as all those layout ones we saw, the header, the footer, the main, the section, nav, sides. All of the layout related ones are going to behave in this way as well. They're all block elements. That means they have the default width of 100%, a default height of 0, but they will grow in height according to the content that is inside of them. Inline elements stay within the flow of what's around them. So we've seen some of these before. We've seen links, we've seen the strong and M tag. We haven't seen spans yet. And I put images here. Images are inline. If you look in the specifications, it does specify they are inline, but they don't act exactly like an inline. So they're only a sort of in there. They're a special case a little bit. So if we look at this layout that we are working on right now, we have these are our block level elements. My H1 here, my paragraph here, and then my second paragraph there. Those are the blocks. No matter what I try and do, they will stack one on top of each other. It always creates a new line, and this is a good thing. You put a paragraph in, you want it to be on a new line of content. You put in a new heading, you want it to be on a new line of content. We don't always want to create new lines, though. That's what we have the inline ones for, which are here. We have my 3 links as well as this text, which is bold, which I'm using my strong tag for. It's a good thing these don't automatically create new lines, because if they did, that would not be very useful at all. We wouldn't want our links or our bold and italic text always forcing new lines along the way. That would just be terrible. Block elements are pretty, you can do whatever you want with them. There's not a lot to them. You can put anything you want inside of them. You can do what you want with them as far as margins and padding, and it's sort of, they're easy. Inline elements, there are a few important things that you need to know about them. So you can only nest other inline elements inside of them. So here I gave the example of a link inside of a strong element. You could have strong text, and inside of that bold section, you could include a link. Or if you had an M, or even you could have a link, and then inside of your link, you can include a strong and make only 1 word or 2 words inside of a long link. That could also work, but you can't put a div inside of a strong or something like that. It's not considered valid. So inline elements, you cannot have a block element inside of an inline element. And also, they will only respect the margin, padding, and borders that are placed on the right and left side and not on the top and the bottom. This is we're going to see it in a second when we play with it, to help them keep with the flow of everything. They will let you do it on the right and the left, but not on the top and the bottom. And also, I didn't put a bullet point here because generally you don't try and do it anyway, but you cannot set a width and a height on an inline element. It just doesn't do anything whatsoever. So let's go and take a look using our example here. So I've added that link that we originally had here, and I've put this in bold so we can use it as a bit of a better example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my strong element here, and let's give this a background of yellow. So it fits in with our layout that we're doing. And we can see it's there. Oop, I can't read the text now, so let's just come and change that color to black so we can see the text inside of that. And this is just the only reason I'm doing this on the strong tag is so we can actually see the exact shape and size of my strong tag. And we're going to play with our padding as well, so it's useful if you have a background on it. So you can see this inline element. I can still have a background on it. You can pretty much style it how you want. But if I came onto my strong element here and I give this a width of 50 pixels and I come and take a look at it, and actually we can put it like this so we can see that it changes live. I don't actually see the width hasn't changed. The width is exactly the same. Or if I give this a height of 200 pixels, you can see nothing has changed. It will not accept a width and a height. You can put them, they just won't do anything at all. So it won't break anything. It just ignores it pretty much. I can give them a margin right and left. So if I did a margin right of 50 pixels on here, it does create that space of 50 pixels there. But if I made that margin a top instead, nothing happens. It doesn't create this big gap on top of my text. And you can imagine that's a good thing. Imagine if you had a link in your text and all of a sudden it had this giant gap on it, it wouldn't flow with the text that's around it anymore. They've pretty much put these in almost as like safeguards to prevent stuff from happening. So as I also mentioned, you can play around with the padding a little bit. So on your padding, we'll do padding right this time of 100 pixels. And it works just like you'd expect padding to. It's like the margin, but it includes the background. So I have an extra 100 pixels of empty space, including that yellow background that I put on it. Now, what's funny is I said that it doesn't accept a padding top or bottom. It actually does work. It's just the rest of the stuff around it ignores it. So this is really awkward and annoying. I wish it just didn't accept the property personally, because you can see that my other text is still there. Like it's just hiding underneath this giant yellow box. And maybe I should make this a little bit smaller. I'm going to make it pretty small. So you go. You can see that other text is there. It's pretending like that padding isn't there. It's as if it isn't. So it's adding the background, it's adding the padding without it affecting the layout around it, which is really, really strange and really awkward. And the main thing I wanted to talk about really, because this can cause problems when you do it and you're not sure why it's covering stuff up or why it's not really acting in the way you would hope it would. So that's pretty much it for this video, where it's the main thing I want you to remember is that inline elements are a little bit special. You can't put a div or a navigation inside of a strong or a link, which makes sense anyway. I don't know why you'd want to, but also they will only respect your margins, borders, and padding on the left and the right. And padding and borders on the top and the bottom can actually cause some problems. So in general, we try not to do those things. There are ways around it. We can play with some stuff, but for the most part, the styling of inline elements, which we're going to be doing a little bit now in the next couple of videos, it's good to know the limitations of what we can style while we're doing it. The span element is a new inline element that we haven't taken a look at. It is a very useful element for decoration, for making things look a little bit nicer. It is used just like the strong and the M, which we saw in module 1. Just like the strong and the M, it is used for styling text, but unlike them, it doesn't have any default styling, and it also has no semantic meaning. And by semantic meaning, I mean is we saw when we did the strong, it actually gives that text stronger importance than the other text around it. When we use M, it's to place emphasis on that text, so it changes the way the text is read. It has actual meaning to it. A span element doesn't add any value. It doesn't add any meaning. It's just used to change what something actually looks like. And if we just use the span itself, it's pretty much a little useless. So normally we're using a class to help make it a little bit easier to target with CSS. We don't have to do that though, but we can. In a layout like this, what we might use a span for is doing something like this, where we're changing the color of a couple of words inside of a paragraph. So here we used a strong tag to make this text bold, So we can do the same type of thing to change the color of our text here. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can do that. So I have the layout open here. And what I want you to do is try and do it yourself without me giving any advice. So you'd first have to come over here into the markup. You'd have to find the text that we want to make yellow, which is these two words here. As I said, it's just like the strong. So instead of using strong, we just write the word span. And then after you've done that, you want to go over to your styles, give that span a different font color to make it stand out. I also mentioned that often we use a class. In this case, if you don't use a class, it's okay. You don't have to. But I'm going to put a class on it when I do it myself. So if you're not too sure right now and you just want to watch me do it, you can. But I really, really encourage you to go ahead and try and figure this out on your own because it is so similar to the strong tag that I think you can do it. So I really hope you got that working, or if you did run into any trouble, let's look at how we do it. So here I'm going to come and I'm going to open span here. I'm going to come over to here and I'm going to close my span. And as I mentioned, most of the time we're going to be putting a class on our span, even though in this situation, because it's a simple example, it's not necessary. And I'm going to call it accent color because on my classes, I always want to give them a meaningful name. So what is this span being used for? It's being used to change the color of the text. And accent color, I'm adding a punch color from that's being used in my document. So I'm going to call it accent color like that. I'll come over to my style sheet. So since I've already set all of this up for you, if you didn't do it from the very, very beginning, try doing it now. We're just selecting that span that we just set up and changing the color of it. So whether you did it the first time or you just did it now, let's take a look at how we can do it. So it would just be doing our dot accent color. So just like our links here, it is a class. So we do need the dot in front of it to select the class of accent color. And then open and close curly brackets. And I can say color. And in this case, I'll just use yellow. Even though it's not the exact color of yellow that we're after, we can see that we have changed the color of the text inside of our paragraph just like that. So as I mentioned earlier, spans are used pretty much for just decorating things and making them stand out a lot. You may not even use them on every single project, but it's super good to understand how they work and to be able to control them. We're going to next look at how we can style links. So we can get them away from this ugly blue color and get them to look a little bit better because unlike spans where we're just doing the normal state, links actually have different states in them. There's when we hover on top, there's when we're clicking on them, and there's a few different things that we can do with our links. All right, so we're going to be looking at styling links because links are pretty much part of every single website that's out there. And because we're also talking about inline elements, so I find it only makes sense right now to look at how we can style our links a little bit more too. So we can change the style of a link like any other element by using the simple element selector. You probably guessed that already. Maybe you've already played around with that a little bit yourself. But links have a different states that we can style them as well. We have the default link state, which is just, if you just did your A selector like that, it's pretty much going to overwrite the default link state. But there's also visited links. So I'm sure you've been on Google and you've gone, you check the first site, you hit back, and then that link is actually showing as purple because it's letting you know you've already been there and you've already visited that. So we can style that to look the way we want it to. There is the focus state, which is if you're navigating a website by keyboard, we're going to see that in a little bit more detail. The hover, which everyone is always familiar with, that is when the mouse or the cursor is hovering over the link, but without anybody clicking on it. So when you hover over, it usually changes in appearance somehow to let you know that that is something you can interact with. And there is also the active style, which is sort of the forgotten one because it's the style while you're actively clicking on it. So if you click and actually hold the mouse button down, what does that link look like? It's usually just a flash because you click pretty fast and then the website's off to the next place anyway because you just clicked a link anyway, but we're going to see how we can style it. Now, to target any of those specific states rather than just the normal selector itself, we use something called a pseudo class. And a pseudo class is always done with a colon like this. So there's no space there. It's just a colon link. So that's the default link state, which doesn't incorporate all the other ones. Then we have the visited state, the focus state, the hover state, and the active state. So these are all using pseudo classes. So let's go and take a look with the one we have right here. So with what you've just learned, why don't you try and style it? What I've done is I've actually changed this color to the one that I had in the finished design. So you can use this color and or other colors as well, and just see how much progress you can make and try playing around with them a little bit. And once you've done that and you've played around with it a little bit, you can I'm going to go into a bit more detail on all of them and sort of some best practice. And some things you have to do in a specific order to actually get them to work, but I just want you to experiment with them a little bit right now to get used to it. And if ever you forgot one of them along the way, you can come back to the slide right here, just click on it and it will go full screen so you can see the different states written out there. And remember, again, it's a colon link. There's no spaces anywhere, because if you use a space, it will not work. So hopefully you got some nice styles on your links there. And what I'm going to do is start with my A link like this. And let's give it a color, and I'm going to give it that color. You can see all of my links right away changed. All three of them instantly went over to that color I had because they're all in their default link state. As soon as I click on that, all of them have changed over to purple. And that's because purple is the default visited link. You'll also notice that if I click and hold, it's changing to red. And if I just click, it flashes in red because red is the default active state. So if we style something with a link like this, it is always, we actually pretty much have to go through and change all of them. So I might want to do a visited, and then just for fun, let's change the color to white. So it looks less like a link, but we still have that text decoration, the little underline that is on there. So we end up with the two different ones. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my index here and I'm going to change, because what I did with those links originally is had them going to nowhere. If you're just doing a single site or you're just practicing, you can give a link the href of just to a hashtag, because that's pretty much linking to the page that you're currently on. It's linking back to itself. It will work because if we don't have an href on it, it won't even render as a link. So this lets it render without actually having something. But let's switch this over to somewhere else. We can take a look and see that there's the two different states: a site I have not visited yet and a site I've already visited. Most of the time, if you're on somewhere like Google that you want to let people know that they've already visited a site, you're going to bother with this. But a lot of the time, you're not going to bother with a visited link. In the navigation of a website, you don't usually have visited links showing up because they know of the 5 pages that are there, and you don't really need to tell them where they've been and stuff like that. It's more of if you're linking off to external sites to let people know they've already been to those places. So a lot of the time what you find is these two are actually the same color. And what I'm doing now is I'm actually putting the same code twice. So if you remember back to a couple of videos ago, we saw how we can, if we have the same property for two different values, we can actually include those in the same selector. So if you remember how to do that, go ahead and do that now. And if not, though, that's cool. I'm going to look at it right away. So if you did remember, it is by putting a comma and then coming up and putting the same selector right there. So I can remove this one now because they both have the same. And one thing that's really important is there is the comma here, because if we take the comma out, you can see it's all gone back to the defaults, because this is something completely different that we're going to see soon enough. So there's my link, my visited. The next one is the focus. So let's create a focus. And I'm going to give this a color of aquamarine, just because it's going to be easy enough to see on this dark background color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click in here just so this is my active window, and I'm going to push tab on my keyboard. And you can see that now this link is the focus state. And if I push tab again, it goes to contact me, and then I can go to my third link there. You might not navigate websites through the keyboard, but a lot of people do. Power users do it, and people who, for accessibility reasons, might also be doing it as well. So having a focus state is actually pretty important because it lets people really visually see which link they're on. Now, very often, the focus state and the hover state are very similar to one another. So if we come down and say a hover, and I'll do it as two different ones for now, color, and I'll give this one the color of Firebrick. So we'll see the difference. So I'm going to tab on that, and you can see that when I'm tabbed over it, it has gone over to my aquamarine. But if I hover on top, it's switching over to my Firebrick there. So that's the difference between focus, is when I'm pushing tab to go through. But if I'm hovering on top of something, or I'm putting my cursor over it before I click, it's going to use the hover state. So we can see those are all switching right there. Now, with the hover state, often your focus and the hover state will be the same. They do not have to be, though. If you want them to be styled different, by all means you can, but do try and include a focus state. And the last one is our active. So let's give this one a color of, I'm going to give it the color of plum, just because once again, we'll be able to see it well. I currently have my normal link state. So we're in our link state. I'm going to hover on top. So now we're in my hover state. And then I'm going to click and hold, and you can see it's switched over to the plum color until I let go. Now it won't let me go to Google, but that's all right. Or we can come on this one and we'll see that how it's working like that. You'll notice because this one actually isn't going anywhere, if I click on it and then move, it's now in the focus state because I just clicked on it, and that sort of selects it. But if I click anywhere else, or if I push tab, I can easily enough focus onto something else. Now, one thing that's really important about using these as well is the order of them really, really matters. Because you notice I have a regular link, and then I'm going into a focus, and then I'm going into a hover. Let's just switch these two around for a second. And we're going to see now, if I tab onto something, it's now in the focus state. But if I hover on top of it, it's still in the focus state. So this one is still winning. If I hover on this, you can see my hover code is working. And the reason for that is it is in the focus state and the hover state both at the same time right now. So it's in this state and this state. Which one should I use? Well, I'm always going to use the last one. CSS always chooses the last option when there's equivalent specificity, which is something we're going to talk about a lot more really soon. But basically here I have my paragraph font size 18, and here I'm going to say paragraph font size is 30 pixels, and the 30 pixels wins because this is the last one. So the same thing is what's happening here, where these are pretty much equivalent to one another. So it's going to the last one and saying that one wins. So that's why when I'm in hover state and focus state, my focus is winning, unless I move this back on top. And now when I come through, that one is winning. And this is really, really important because sometimes someone will put an active, but they're going to put their active all the way up here, or even all the way up here. And the active will never work because it's an active state, but it's also a link. If we move all of this on top here, my things are never going to change because they're always just a link. Whether they're a hover or in a focus state or in an active state, they're still just a link. So if this one is the last one, no matter what CSS I do, this one is always going to win at the end of the day because it's the last one. So the order of all of this really, really matters. Just as a quick tip to make your life a little bit easier, a lot of the time, you're not going to style the A link. You're just going to start with A. And what the A will do is, you can see right now I have all my defaults on here. So the default colors are all coming through. If I set my color right away to this, it's going to replace all of the different states. It has my hover state, my active state. I'm clicking right now, it's not changing. If I tab on top, they're not changing. So if I just do an A without a pseudo class on it, that replaces everything. I find this easier because that just handles most of my bases for me. And then I can come onto my A hover and I can change the color of this to the color that I want when I'm hovering on top. And now I have my hover state done. I'm not even going to worry about an active state right now. But as I did say, we do want to include a focus. So I'll also put my comma and then an A focus on this one as well. So I can either tab across or I can hover on top, and they're both going to work. Before I let you go into the next lesson, when we're styling links, it's really important to make sure that when we're styling them, that people know they can interact with them. It should be extremely obvious. Change the color on hover and focus first of all. So if somebody's hovering on top, that they see that it's changing so they know it interacts. Because yes, your mouse cursor, let's go take a look. You can see the mouse cursor on a link will actually change to a hand. But if the color of it isn't changing, we have the little hand there, but it's not that obvious. And people are used to this behavior. It's something we've been conditioned for. We've literally been conditioned to see things, hover on top, and it changes a little bit when it is something that's interactive. So make sure you let people know that it's super obvious and make sure it's on the hover and on the focus. And I'd also say leave text decoration on, or if you turn it off, make sure that it's still obvious that it's a link. And what I mean by text decoration is the underline that's on there. Because sometimes people they're going to come in and say white, and it's not even super obvious those are links right now. Like this does not look like a link to me. So I probably would change the color of it no matter what. Maybe it's a more subtle difference though. Maybe it's just a little bit of a gray. So you do something like that. So like there's this subtle little difference, but at least with the text underline on there, you're sort of giving it away. And then on the hover here, maybe the color, even if it's still not getting I'm going to try gray here. I don't know if how much that keyword's going to do it. Yeah, that's not too bad. So at least I'm really I see the underline, I'm assuming it's a link, and then it's confirmed without even having to pay attention to the cursor. I'm smacking you over the face and letting you know, yes, I can interact with it. So just some quick tips there. And once again, I've said it before, but always make sure to include a focus state as well as your hover. We can do it on the same selector, so there's no excuse not to do it. So in the next lesson, we're going to sort of start practicing a little bit of everything we've done because we've covered a lot of material so far. We're going to put it all into practice. And then after that, we're going to get a bit more fun. We're going to look at how we can turn a link that just looks like a regular little link like we've done here and actually style them to look like buttons. So as I said at the end of the last video, it is practice time. It's time to go over everything we've learned so far. So we're going to be creating a simple page from scratch. And that means going over everything we've learned so far, including from the very, very beginning, the crash course that we did together. It also includes something we haven't really seen yet, but I do think you have the knowledge to be able to do it at this point because I want to start pushing you a little bit. But the important thing right now is reinforcing all the skills that we have learned. Things are going to start getting a little bit more complicated, but before we can do that, we really want to make sure these foundational skills that you have so far that you are starting to understand them. So I want you to take your time and make this as perfect as possible. I don't want you to rush through it. I want you to make sure that you really understand all the different things and you're able to do this layout because as you're going to see, it is not a complicated layout. It's not a complicated layout on purpose because I want you to be able to be successful in building this, but I also want to make sure you're able to do this because the skills that we need to do this are what we're going to layer on top of as things get more complicated. These are really the essentials that we've looked at up until now on how we can make a basic layout like this. So I've given you this slide here that has most of the information that you're going to need to actually style this up. So as you can see on the left, there are the colors, there's the font sizes, we have our H1 at the top, we have the H2, and then all three of these here are paragraphs. I've given you spacing that we're going to have in between elements. You'll notice this says 25, this says 9. You might say that it looks a little bit, this doesn't quite look like more than double of this space. It has to do with a little bit of how fonts are rendered and spaced. We'll get more into that when we get into typography at a bit of a deeper level. Now, there are a few things I haven't put in here. One thing that is really important that I put in here is the total width of this is 500 pixels, but there is some padding in here. So just do be careful with that and take that into account. I'll be using 25 pixels of padding all the way around. What I've also done is I've given you the image already, and I've given you the text here in a comment at the bottom of the index file. But you'll notice it is a completely blank file. We want to go from complete scratch once again and start building a page. So we have to go back and remember all the ways, all the different things we need to make a page from complete scratch. So if you get stuck along the way, you can always see how I did it and then come back and finish it on your own. But I really encourage you to do all of this or as much of this as you can. But if you're really stuck on something, skip it and just keep going and try and get as much done on your own as possible. And then you can come back and see how I did it for any of the things that you get stuck on. I'd also encourage you, even if you manage to get it looking perfect, watch when I do it, because as soon as we're done this, I'm going to let you go, but then you'll be able to wait a few seconds and I'm going to start coding it up. And I'm going to try and give you some of the best practices and the way I think about a layout when I'm doing it, including naming things and all of that. Before I let you go, just a couple of more quick things. Just make sure here when we're looking at it, this is my H1. It can be all by itself. If you want to put that in a header, by all means, go for it. Over here, though, just when we're looking at it, I can see that this has a background color on it. So right away, I know that this has to go inside of something like a div or a section that is the content of my page. So because I see this has a total width on it and it's containing all of these other things here, I'm going to give this a div when I do it as just a little bit of a tip going forward. So if ever you need to reference this slide, just click on it, bring the slide up, and then you can get any of the information from here that you need while you're coding this up. Now go ahead and do that now. And then once you're done, or if you get stuck in anything, once again, hit play and I'll show you how I would do it. So I hope you got through all of that or most of it and you didn't hit any major snags along the way. Let's go and see how I do it now. So the very first thing we need at the top is my doctype HTML. And then after that, I need my open HTML and close HTML tags where I'm going to start putting my HTML. And I'll go inside of those. And we need two different things in here. We need to have a head and we need to have a body and close body. So if you remember, the head is where our meta information and that stuff goes, the hidden stuff that the user doesn't really see. So for now, I'm only going to put the title up in here. And we'll just call that an awesome blog. For now, we'll use the same we had in the H1. We also will need to put a link to a CSS file in here, but I'm not going to do that quite yet. We'll do that once I create my CSS file. And then over here in my body, I can start writing the content that will actually show up on my page. I'm just going to put an H1 right at the top like this and say an awesome blog. But as I mentioned, if you had that inside of another, either the header or a div, that would be completely fine. And then I'm going to come down and I want to make this box that's going to be holding my other content. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to put that inside of a div. Now, in this case, if you have a div and you don't give it a class, you could get away with it because it's the only div that's going to be on our page. But in general, if you're using a div, give it a class and try and make that class name descriptive. So I'm going to call this blog post because that's what this is. This is a div that has a blog post inside of it. In here, we need a few things. I'm going to have my h2, which will be an awesome blog post, goes h2. I'm going to need my image. So image, do you remember what we need here? It's an src for source. So that's the source of my image. And don't forget, you should also include your alt tag. So the alt could be a bright yellow window on a blue wall. And my source here will be images/window.png. So just you need to make sure you're writing the full file name. So if you ran into any problems here, when you did it, just make sure we need to go into the folder itself, and then we need to get the exact file name that we have here, including the file extension. And up until now, I'd been using a lot of JPEGs. So there we have a PNG instead. And now I can start writing the rest of my content. So I actually have 3 paragraphs here. There was these 2 plus the read more, which was only a link, but I'm still going to put that inside of a paragraph. So often what I like to do is just paragraph, 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 and then copy and paste the text into them. So I'll cut ahead while I do that. So there we go. I have all my content in there now, so I can delete this comment. I don't really need it anymore. And this read more should be a link. So let's start with that link. And there's a couple other ones in there too. So href. I don't have anywhere to go. So I'm going to put a hashtag like we've seen in some of my other videos. But if you put an address or anything else in there, that's perfectly fine. If you don't include the href at all and there is just an A, it's not going to work. It won't render as a link. So we need to make sure we have some sort of href attribute inside of our link to actually make the link work. I have 2 other links in here, so I'm going to do those the same way. And I'm going to speed that up while I do it just because I'm going to have to open and close this a couple of times to see where they are. All right, so now I have my links in place. I have everything in place. What I'm going to do is save and take a look to make sure that everything is there, that my links are showing up and that they're working, and everything is looking pretty good. The last thing I'm going to do before I move on is on this last paragraph down here at the bottom, I'm going to give this a class of read more. Like that. Now, in reality, in the real world, you could get away without that being in a paragraph. We could leave that in an A just like that at the bottom, and it would work fine. A lot of the time, you'll see something like that. So it doesn't have to be put in a paragraph in this case, but I'm going to give it a paragraph that I'm putting it in just to go back over that we can give classes a style on it. So we can give them a class that can give them some custom styling so I can fix the margin that's going to be on there. Because our paragraphs will be coming in with a default margin, obviously. Great. So all of that is in place. It's looking good. Now we can go through and style it. So we have to make our CSS file for that. So I'm going to come over here to my files. I'm going to right click and choose new folder, and I'm going to make a CSS folder. And then inside that CSS folder, I'm going to make a new file called style.css. Once again, if you made a different name or if you didn't include it in a folder, if it was just with the index here, it's not the end of the world by any means at all. So now we need to link to that. So link is an href is equal to, and don't forget we also need the rel. And I'm filling out all of this. I'm closing my tag, and then I'm coming back in just so I don't forget any of the things along the way, especially this closing bracket or sometimes one of these closing parentheses, because that is often a mistake that people make because they write in the href and then they forget about it. So my href is going to my CSS folder, and I called it style.css. I think I usually did styles. This time I did style.css, so style sheet. Let's just go make sure. Yeah, I got the right CSS name. So let's come into my style sheet, and let's just say body has a background of red to make sure that that's actually all working and that everything is connected properly. So I should get the red background on here. And as we can see, we have the red background on there, so we know it's working. It's hurting my eyes, so let's go and turn that off because we obviously don't want that to be there. Now, what do we want? Well, let's come back up. And the first thing I'm going to do is do sort of the global styles that I like talking about. My body, I don't really need to do anything on it in this case, but what we do need is to start styling our font styles here. So let's go and start with those. The one thing I could do on my body is set the font size to 16 pixels. That does happen to be the default size of the browsers. And if you see somebody saying the paragraph should be a certain size, I'd encourage you to make the body, put that font size on the body itself, just so you don't have to be so specific to style the paragraphs, because there's other elements other than paragraphs. You know, you might have a link like this one that's not inside of a paragraph. In this case, I put it inside of one, but if it wasn't, it wouldn't actually select that and change the font size of it. And then you'd have to do extra CSS. So for font size, for font color, different things like that would be on paragraphs, just place that on the body so it goes through and applies to everything. That's something called inheritance, and it's something we're going to be looking at more in the future. So you know what, we'll do that just because I said that it's a good idea. So font size is 16 pixels. The next thing is we have my H1. So my H1 has two things. It has the font size of 48 pixels, and we gave it a color, and the color was 2E7AD3. In my file that I gave you, it was all caps, and here I'm writing it in lowercase. It really doesn't make a difference one way or the other when you're doing it. So if we take a look, that's looking pretty good. The last thing I'm going to do is a text align center on this to center it on the page. I know that's working, so I'm not going to bother making it bigger. Next, I have my H2. So my H2 here has a font size. It was 32 pixels. I'm not opening and closing the reference slide on the side because that would be annoying for you. Color on it was 104C90. And we don't need to change anything else on that, I believe. So let's go and take a look. Great. So one thing you'll notice is I didn't set a bold font style on either of these, and that's because headings by default already are bold. It might not match exactly with the demonstration one I gave because the fonts are a little bit different, but overall, and that really depends on which operating system you're on, because different operating systems have different default fonts. So it might look more similar to mine, or it might look a little bit different than if you're on a Mac or a PC from this example that I gave. But as long as they are bold, we are happy. The paragraphs, I don't have much to do. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to my blog post. The first thing I'm going to do is give it the background color on there, which was my F1, F1, F1. And I'm going to give it a width of 450 pixels. And we'll explain that in a second. And let's go and just see what that actually looks like. So we can see it is containing all of my information like I want it to do in the finished version, which is great. But I mentioned that we need a little bit of padding on this because we don't want all these different things stuck to the side of this gray box, which is why I put my width to a total of 450, because I did mention I was going to put a padding of 25 pixels. So right now I'm using the padding shorthand, meaning it's applying to all four sides. So I'm placing 25 pixels on the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. So if we go and take a look at what that actually looks like, we can see that we're getting that spacing and it's looking a lot better. Now we have a bit too much space going on the top here. We're going to fix that in a minute. But on the left and the right side here, I'm getting 25 pixels. Then I have a width of 450 pixels. And then I have 25 pixels on this side. So that means 25 plus 25 is 50, plus 450 means a total width of 500 pixels, which is what we wanted to have. Now we can fix some of the spacing on this. So let's go ahead and do that next, because one of those spacings is, I should have done it on the H1 already, because in the file here, I say we want 45 pixels there and 45 pixels here. And as we saw when we covered our margins and padding, we have those default margins that are coming on stuff, which is why in my version that I have going right now, we have that giant space on top because we have 25 pixels of padding, plus we have the default margin coming on my H2 here. So to keep this at exactly 25 and keep all the sides the same, we need to do like we did in that other one. I'm going to give this a margin of 0, and I'm going to give this one right away a margin. Now, if you already gave it the margin top of 45 and a margin bottom of 45, that's great. I want you to also be able to do it with the shorthand. So come in right now and give this the margin top and bottom of 45 and left and right of 0 using the shorthand if you didn't do that when you did your own. All right, so if you tried and it didn't quite work or you didn't see any change, it isn't a big change to begin with, but it's going to be a 45 and a 0. And so it's 45 on the top and the bottom and a 0 on the left and the right. And from H2, I put the margin of 0, so let's go and take a look at how both of these have affected things. So this is looking nice. I'm happy with that. It might not look very different because it's really, really similar to what the margins already were on my awesome blog post here. Where we have a bit of a problem is this, where we got this space working out well, but now I'm probably a little bit too close to my image. And I didn't give you an actual size to put on that, but this is the type of thing you should be looking out for. And I said to try and make it perfect. So comparing your version here to the version that we had there. So we do need a little bit of space included in there. So there's two different ways you could approach this. You could do a margin of 0, and that's going to reset all of your margins. And then you could come here and say margin bottom of, say, 10 pixels. And I'm just guessing at that number. And when I do that, you'll see it is adding that margin to the bottom of my design here. So I have my margin of 10 pixels there, which is awesome. And it works fine because what this is doing is saying all my margins are 0. And then it gets to this and goes, oh, I need a margin bottom of 10. The one thing you cannot do is you cannot have this margin bottom of 10 coming up over here. Because if we do that, it's saying the margin bottom is 10. And then it's going to read this line next. And it's going to say, oh, no, all the margins are actually 0. So if I try doing it that way around, you can see it's actually setting it to 0 on the bottom, even though I specified the bottom margin should be 10 pixels. So just be careful when we're doing our CSS. The order of things here really does matter. So, and this is a problem that I see a lot of beginners making. So just do know that if you want to reset everything and then come back after and change something, you can. Or it's probably a little bit better to either specify margin top of 0, margin bottom, or just to do it all in the shorthand here. So see, this one's a little bit easier when you're doing two values like this because it's top and bottom and left and right. So see if you can remember how to do only, so we want to set the top margin to 0, the bottom margin to 45, and the left and right both to 0. So see if you can remember how to do that with the shorthand. All right, so I have my top of 0. I can do a 0 and I can do a 45 pixels like that. Now, if you did it with an extra 0 here at the end, that's perfectly fine too. That's usually and often what you'll actually see. So we're doing, if you remember, it goes clockwise. We're doing the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. So we're going from, we go in the same way a clock would go around, starting always at the top. But if you remember when we covered this briefly, you can do it with 3 values if you want to. It's going to be the top, the right, and the left, and then the bottom if you specify 3 values. So just as a little bit of a reminder that you can pull it off with 3 values if you want to keep using and pushing with the shorthand. We're almost done now. The 2 things I have left to do are to center this blog post on the screen, and then I want to style my links a little bit. So let's come onto here and say that this has a margin of 0 auto. We've done this a few times, so I'm not going to put it and ask you to do it. So if you remember, this is setting the left and the right margin to 0, which will make them automatically adjust and space everything out equally on both sides. No matter the size of our screen, it stays centered in there. And why did I put 45 pixels here? I'm not too sure. Let's bring that back down to 10 while we're here. That looks a little bit better. There we go. Not sure why I chose 45 when I did that. Okay, so the 2 things left to fix are our spacing here on the bottom and the color of our links. So let's come and do the read more first. Read more. I can just do a margin bottom of 0, or we could do the shorthand and just say margin of 0. So it has 0 on all sides, just like that. And it should work perfectly fine. Let's go take a look. Yep, we can see that my spacing on the bottom is now equal all the way around. So we can go and style the links. Now for the links, I'm actually going to come back up to here instead of putting them down at the bottom because I sort of have this section of typography related things. So my headings, if I had paragraph styles, if I had other type stuff, I would do it here. So I'm going to include my links over here as well. And I'm just going to do A. If you did it with the A link, that's awesome. Super duper. I'm just going to do it with my A. And I'm going to say that the color is that orangey yellow color, more orange, I guess, FF8000. And it gives us our orange color. So there they are, but you might have noticed in the finished design, I actually had them as bold. And I haven't looked at bold, but I have mentioned really briefly in passing that we have a font weight property. So whether you figured that one out or not, it's don't be disappointed in yourself if you didn't. It's not something we have looked at. Maybe you looked it up online, or maybe you were just going to wait for me to show you how to do it. So it is the font weight property. And we're going to be getting a lot more into the font properties when we do this. I'm just going to write bold for now, even though we're going to see there's other ways and values here that we can use for font weight much later on. Now, before I go and look at what this actually looks like, because I'm pretty sure it's looking like I want it to, I want to include a hover and a focus state for these links, because we should always include a hover and focus to really make it obvious that they are interactive. I've mentioned before, we want to make the link stand out. We also really need that interactivity of it standing out as well. The color is one thing, but people are so used to it changing. So if you did it already, hats off to you, because I didn't include it in any of the instructions or on the slide or anything like that. So hats off for doing it. If you didn't think of it, that's fine. Don't worry about it at all. Go and do it right now. I'm going to use one of the two blue colors as my hover color when I do it. So hopefully you got that working. So I'm going to do my A hover just like that, and put a comma, and then do my A focus. So I can do both my hover and my focus at the same time. And I can start writing my CSS. The other thing I'm going to do a little bit differently now is I'm actually going to come and put this on its own line like that. It doesn't change anything whether you write it like this or if you write it like that. As long as you have the comma separating them, it's the exact same thing as far as the CSS is considered. It's just a little bit easier to see the different states that you're selecting when you write it like this. So I'm going to change the color here to the darker blue. So that's 104C90. Whether you used one of the blues, a different orange that you found on your own, any color whatsoever, as long as it's different and it's obvious when it's changing, you're on the right track and you're showing the user that it can be changed. So it is perfect. So let's go and take a look at how all of that is looking. And that is super duper. I'm pretty happy with that. It is looking pretty much spot on. This is a little bit less bold than my final version that I'd shown, but overall, I'm not worried about that at all. It is looking exactly like I wanted it to. So I hope you're able to follow along, that you're super happy and we're able to get it. And I hope if you weren't or you got stuck, I answered any questions you might have had. If you got stuck anywhere along the way and you just watched me do it, what I'm going to say is actually go back and try and redo the whole thing on your own. And of course, you can go back through and watch what I did if you get stuck again, or if there's something you're not sure about. And of course, ask in the Q&A if there's anything you're not sure about. Go in there. If there's something that didn't work, something that's not working, or you just want clarification on it, ask away, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. This is also a really good time to take a break and just let all of this information absorb before we get into this last stretch of our CSS fundamentals.